Okay, we added a special segment this week. We think it's totally apropos for our Halloween, special Halloween show. I asked Rocco, because I thought it just really made sense for this week, to talk about 5 of the greatest horror movies ever made. So take it away, Rocco. Let's have the Halftime Howie horror list.
Thank you very much, Howie. This is a list of the 5, what I think is the top 5 horror movies of all time. This I feel like is very well, I really thought this out as best to my ability as I could. The 5th film that I picked on the list is Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre from Tobe Hooper. And the reason why I picked this movie is that it's definitely one of the first of its kind. It's an intense movie. It was based loosely on the serial killing incidents of Ed Gein. And it created something that had not ever been seen in horror before. It created this kind of realistic, kind of intense horror. And what's absolutely amazing about this movie is that there's like a rawness to it and a realism to it that you did not see in horror movies before. And I think it really has held up very well over time. And I think what's incredible about the movie is that there's hardly, the movie has like a ghastly look to it, but there's hardly any blood in it. It's just mainly pure intensity. And that's something that most people that do horror movies, they never quite do that because they're always afraid that that they want something shocking. It's hard to make a movie shocking without, really, being on that level of making it something that's going to make you too sick to your stomach. So like I said, what makes this movie succeed is the fact that it doesn't quite go through the R-rated levels of trying to shock you, which is, a lot of profanity and a lot of gore and stuff like that. So I think this really has held up extremely well because of that. The 4th film on the list is Dracula, the original Universal Studios Dracula, directed by Todd Browning. And this was a tough choice for me because I feel like each Dracula movie, as much as I love them all, I'm a big fan of Dracula movies, they've all had some sort of flaw about them that kind of prevent them from being, I feel, totally perfect. And it's hard to do. But the reason why I picked this particular Dracula movie is because this was the original Dracula movie, and it set a lot of the classic aspects of what we know to be Dracula, the way Dracula looked, the way Dracula talked. Bela Lugosi brought a lot to this particular Dracula that really, made it the distinct Dracula we all know today. The imagery of the movie in the beginning where you see him in Transylvania, like that really set the tone for a lot of movies today. And yes, there are some weaknesses with this particular Dracula movie, like it kind of, the appeal of it doesn't quite hold your attention by the second half of the movie. It becomes revelatory to the second half that it's more like the play it was based on. It doesn't feel like it has that level of cinematic grandiosity that we would see in later horror movies. So as much as that is a weakness of this particular Dracula movie, it's still the best Dracula movie and it's still one of the best horror movies out of all time. So the 3rd movie I picked on the list is Halloween. The original John Carpenter Halloween is also one of my favorite movies ever. And what I love about Halloween, in light of the new movie, and what I think makes this still like one of the best horror movies of all time, is a movie that does not really go through the grotesque kind of shock value that you would see in this. You hardly see any blood in this movie. What makes this work is the atmosphere, the suspense, and I love that. And I think that's what makes this movie really held up is the fact that everything is suggested in terms of the music, in terms of the atmosphere, the motif, the fact that you're kind of slowly seeing everything play out. And I think that's what makes a great horror movie, is all about not trying to shock you and make you sick to your stomach, but make you feel like, you get this sense of terror. And I think that's one of the great building blocks of what makes a good horror movie. And Jamie Lee Curtis is definitely one of the best characters. It definitely, it created the ultimate slasher movie, definitely something that is become part of the bedrock of the great modern horror movie today, which is the idea of people being picked off by a mysterious creature, a creature played out from reality, basically, this idea of like a serial killer as like a real-life monster. So that definitely makes Halloween one of the greatest horror movies ever to this day. The second one on my list is George Romero's Night of the Living Dead. it definitely is another benchmark in horror movies because it definitely took horror to a new level. It was definitely like the first time. I mean, before Night of the Living Dead, most horror movies were meant to be funny and a little silly and, something that kids love to go see. But this definitely kind of threw that, by the wayside. It was a more realistic kind of horror. It was a horror that was very much like a very nihilistic kind of horror movie, with the way everything turns out. It doesn't have this kind of neatly tied in a bow kind of resolution. It's very dark. I mean, even though for a movie that came out back in 1968, this movie still has a kind of raw nihilistic power to it. And it definitely is something that, 50 years later, it still has a kind of power to it that you don't see in a lot of horror movies today. And I definitely feel like it's lived on, and as we had talked about before with Brandon with Walking Dead, it definitely still has its place in the horror world. So I definitely feel Night of the Living Dead is definitely one of the seminal horror movies of all time. And the number one horror movie I'm picking of all time, I feel is the mother of all horror movies in terms of influence and power and all that, and that is the Universal Studios Frankenstein movie from 1931, directed by James Whale. I think it definitely established a lot of the motifs we see in a lot of the greatest horror movies in terms of, the Gothic setting, this whole kind of, larger-than-life monster. It definitely played a lot with the Frankenstein mythos. A lot of it was, from the play, so a lot of what the play already had was not in the original book. But it took the best elements from the original story and made it its own thing. And I think that with James Whale directing it, he had a real sense of like the larger-than-life aspect of cinema. This was definitely one of the earliest sound movies. So it definitely was playing around with a very new aspect of film. And I feel like, James Whale really sort of established what we know to be the great cinematic aspects of the horror movies. Is, like I said, like the Gothic setting and the great theatrical acting that was brought on from the stage and all that. I think really resonates today with what makes a great horror movie. Even though it's black and white and from 1931, and it doesn't really scare the same way it used to, but it definitely shows the fundamental bedrock of what makes a great horror movie. So this is my choices, and I hope you get to see all these movies. You definitely should if you haven't, and happy Halloween.
Great job, Rocco. The top 5 horror movies of all time.